Throughout history, humans have had one thing in common. We always want to kill each other. I'm Tyler Pick, and this is Theaters of War. Hello. Welcome back to Theaters of War. I'm your host for today, Tyler Pick. Now, today we're asking one big question. Why do people fight? As our intro suggests, we've been fighting for a very long time. So let's keep it simple. Why would anyone want to fight? Why would a country invade another? Why would millions of people have died at the hands of others? Why would you want to steal your sibling's sandwich? We fight battles, we fight wars for one massive resource. That is all resources on the planet. And that is the topic for this episode, resources. So what even is a resource? Well, there are many different kinds, and it's all a very broad world that we have to cover here. So let's narrow it down. First of all, a resource is a thing that is available to someone where they are. That means that if a group of people or somewhere where they are, say fertile land, they have fertile land and they have the capacity to farm it, that land is a resource. If people are above a pocket of oil and they can drill for it, then that oil is a resource. The animals in a region are resources. Land is a resource. Money is a resource. Everything that humans use is a resource. In a very broad sense, because of the dominance of humanity on our planet, one could say that we have turned the Earth itself into a resource. More than that, we collect energy from our star, the sun. Our sun is a resource to us. Resources are usually categorized as renewable, meaning we can repeatedly replace it, like food or wind energy, or non-renewable, the opposite, oil and concrete, things that we cannot easily replace once used. Now, with that said, there are many different types of resources available to us. Resources can come natural or be man-made, or even be more complex in their own nature. As long as something is exploitable in some way, it can be probably considered a resource. For example, natural resources. Natural resources are the things that we take out of nature. These resources like iron, coal, steel, sunlight, water, land, vegetation, animals, all make up natural resources of an area. Natural resources are scattered across the planet. Some locations are rich in natural resources. Some are scarce in natural resources. Scarcity of resources would go on to determine much of the future of warfare, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to that later. Another kind of resource is the more human-centric, the artificial resources. That are things people make. So, for example, refined metals to weapons, to even more conceptual things like gold and currency and money, to even people. That's right. People are a resource too. From the ingenuity of a single scientist to a political figure, to the vast quantities of organized labor around the globe, humans too have long been a resource, which have been exploited much like other resources have on our planet. Now, like the tagline of our show says, people wind up killing each other. And we've been fighting and killing each other for a very long time. Let's go to ancient Egypt, for example. Ancient Egypt, we fight wars and battles to secure land and resources there, and to ancient China and endless battles of feudal Europe, to colonial wars and world wars. There is very rarely a time in history where warfare, when resources aren't the foremost reason of a battle. And when looked through this resource lens, you can really start to see how most of our wars actually come down to resource control. Ever wonder why Western nations are seemingly prosperous while third world countries are only considered developing? It's all because the powerful nations are the ones with the resources and the armies to take them from other nations. And we'll get into some specific examples later. Now, there are some things worth mentioning here. Obviously, not all wars are immediately caused by resources. Many are caused by ideology or religion or a single sparking moment. Now, much of this is true. However, if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that many wars who follow these patterns of ideology or religion have an underlying theme of resource gathering. These wars were, in a way, destined to occur in the first place. Places which are resource starved are often finding themselves at war more often, or in civil wars, or in times of crisis. In the words of a great storyteller, you think people make choices. No, people think they make choices. They're going to steer right or they're going to steer left, but they don't build the roads. The big choices already were made for them a long time ago. And in the case of resource-rich land versus resource-poor land, these decisions were made long before humans even decided to go to battle. Now, what are some of the resources people fight over? Well, let's take a look at these two maps. They feature the oldest and most powerful empires in the world, ancient Egypt and ancient China. These nations were the powerhouses of the BC times. Now, can you guess why these nations are situated where they are? Can you guess why their borders lay where they do? Can you guess why their armies organized, fought, and have died for these places? Answer, it's where the food is. Ancient Egyptian empire followed the Nile River and most of the parts of the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. These places have the most bountiful harvests in the world at the time. These nations organized across the Nile River and the Fertile Crescent. The Ming Dynasty, one of the most powerful and populous ancient empires, controlled vast swaths of China. And this land all sat on the most fertile regions of Southeast Asia. So that leaves the question, did humans create these borders to get their food? Or did all of these resources shape the world and where these countries would end up? With food being such a scarce resource in early human organizations and early civilizations, we find that many of the older civilizations, Rome, Egypt, Japan, China, were all able to organize and, thanks to their control of these resources, become these large, sprawling empires. However, thanks to industrialization and the Industrial Revolution, the control over these massive quantities of resources grows exponentially. Following the Industrial Revolution, the need of kingdoms, empires, and governments to secure resources becomes even more vital than before. Factories needed to be powered by coal. Iron ore needs to be extracted and turned into the steel for the manufacture of literally everything that we make. Bauxite needs to be processed into aluminum for its various uses. Rubber must be extracted from nature to be turned into vital components and keep modern machines running. And most critically, especially in the modern day, oil. Oil is the new gold. It can be turned into so many important things in this world, from fuel to plastics to synthetics and artificial rubber, clothing, fertilizer, lubricant. It's used in our industries, in our homes, our cars, our machines. Oil is everywhere in the modern world, and people can't get enough of it. Nations can't get enough of it. So much so that for the last 90 years or so, most of the major wars of the world have either been fought for or won by whomever has oil. Now, there are so many critical reasons which all governments vie for these resources. And as our population drastically increased and our economies grew, so did our demand for more stuff. There are so many examples over wars to go over because of resource battling. And in the next segment, we're going to take a look at some of the most important wars which were spurred on by resources. So where do we all start when it comes to breaking down resource wars? Well, I think we need to start with the biggest war of them all, the Second World War. Now, one might immediately suggest that the war in Europe started because of Nazi ideology and Hitler's dream of expanding his living room. And while yes, the expansionist ideology of the Nazis did define their war aims, the targets of those aims are most revealing. The Wehrmacht blitzed through Poland and signed an agreement with the USSR to gain access to its oil and raw materials for the foreseeable future in order to fuel its armies. Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway to secure the Reich store of iron ore and aluminum production used to produce their guns, ammunition, and aircraft. The German Reich blitzed through the Benelux and into France and seized their massive fertile fields, which was used to create vast swaths of food which could feed the Wehrmacht's large armies. And of course, in the end, Hitler went into the Soviet Union to gain access to their oil fields, which ended up being their downfall. If that's not a conquest for resources, I don't know what is. Over in the Japanese front, the war is much even more obviously for resources. China controlled large quantities of iron and aluminum, which Japan desperately needed to fund its war aims. Japan itself was very resource poor, so it had to go out into the world and conquer. Additionally, they navally invaded the Southeast Asian islands, triggering the Americans to join World War II. Because Japan lacked rubber, steel, aluminum, and most importantly, oil. The United States cut oil shipments to Japan, and that caused them to go down this line of thinking that they have to invade these oil islands, otherwise their country is going to collapse. So arguably, this oil embargo caused Pearl Harbor, caused the American entry into World War II, and of course, caused the ending of that war in a much more dramatic fashion. Now, oil has spurned on these major conflicts during World War II. German war aims in the east, Japanese war aims in the south, but oil continues to be one of the most lucrative and important resources on our planet. Take, for example, the wars in the Middle East. These countless and endless wars in the Middle East have been funded for many particular reasons, but in recent times, it has been for oil. Take, for example, the war in Kuwait. The Gulf War was started by Iraq in 1990 when it invaded the independent nation of Kuwait. Kuwait was selling oil to, in particular, the United States and the UK, and had several production agreements with them. Saddam Hussein took control of Iraq, and the nation was crippled with debt, and they needed money. NATO saw the threat that Saddam Hussein posed and prepared an invasion. Saddam Hussein took control of Kuwaiti oil, and the NATO community responded in great force. Now, they claimed to liberate Kuwait, which they did, absolutely, liberating people from that dictator. But most importantly for them, they got their oil back. Now, this is a repeated story over and over in Middle Eastern countries. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Bahrain, Kuwait, and many more nations are devastated by war because their lands flow with black gold. The United States in particular has a vested interest in the Middle East because of their oil production. It's practically a meme. If you have oil, the United States is coming to get you. And most notably, in our modern day, wars for oil continue to ravage the geopolitical landscape. That's right, we're talking about Donald Trump and his invasion of Venezuela and his current incursions into Iran. Now, Donald Trump claims that the invasion of Venezuela was to take out the narco-terrorist in charge of the country, selling drugs to the United States. However, despite this, he has openly gone on record admitting that he's organizing with American oil corporations, oil barons, and big oil to ensure oil extraction for the United States from Venezuela. It's not a secret that the United States goes to war to secure oil, and there's always a justification that they use, whether it's eliminating terrorists, defending against communists, killing narco-terrorists, but in reality, their pursuits are always guided by oil. There's one more war which I want to talk about, and that is a more obscure kind of war. Now, I'm talking about how oil is an important resource for the United States. But why are these countries even going to war? Why are we killing each other over oil? Oil is lucrative. It brings in money. Billionaire companies are able to extract oil from foreign countries and then sell it at a profit. And so these companies have a vested interest in encouraging war. Now, the war that I want to talk about has been fought for as long as we've had economic systems to fight. War from serfs fighting against their masters, the the war the proletariat brought against the bourgeoisie, the war trade unions fought against corporations, the war the people fight against their system, man versus machine, the class war. Now, this doesn't conventionally fit into the definition of war. However, this is a battle that has been waged for our most important resource, the resource which humanity themselves have determined to be the most important: money. Humanity's wars are fueled by resources, but are also forced on so many people because of money. Hitler came into power in Nazi Germany in 1933 because his Nazi party promised that they could fix the ravaged German economy. Lenin's whole communist revolution was about taking down the elite monarchs, the rich, the top, the bourgeoisie in Russia, and replacing them with a people-led government, a commune, the communists. Even in modern day, we still see this battle take place. In New York, socialist Zoran Mamdani was elected, leading a grassroots campaign funded by the people, taking New York from being a billionaire-run city to one led by the people. And this battle is not one that is ever seemingly ending. From the dawn of humanity, we've had layers where the rich control and the poor must work. And this battle has been weighing in back and forth ways for a very long time, and it's not going to end anytime soon. So let's round things off. Resources are a critical form of, or a critical important thing for all governments to have. Humans battle each other for these resources. When we see that another country has more resources, we want them, and we're gonna go get them. Let's wrap up and go to our final segment, Theater of Thoughts, where I'm gonna discuss any extra little tidbits that I have on war and resources. So there's one thing that I wanted to talk about. Earlier, I mentioned how Japan invaded China and invaded the South Asian islands for their resources. Now, originally, that war was justified in a way partly because of religion. Shintoism had been redesigned in the 1870s because they needed an excuse to expand their borders. They now said that the Japanese were divine, that they had God blood in their veins, and that they needed to expand their influence because they had the divine right to rule. At the same time, that was because Japan was a very resource-poor nation. They saw the wealth of China and the Southeast Asian countries and how they could exploit that for their own. So they literally rewrote their religion so that they could have an excuse to invade China and gain access to their resources. The same thing is true in other parts of the world as well, where we see Nazi ideology being a massive wave of popularity in Germany, and they say that the Germans are going to fix everything. And this ideology is trumped by the fact that the resources that the Nazis would go on to control would help fund their war effort. Their fanatical behavior is fueled literally by oil and their demands of conquest. You can see this in, for example, their overzealousness with Poland oil fields, where when the Germans invaded Poland, they had an agreement with the USSR, but the USSR's borders had more oil, and the Germans tried to encroach on it. Now, all of these resources and all of these wars are a constant battle that humans have been fighting. And I think that there are many reasons why humanity could fight for these resources. But in the modern day, we have such a interconnectivity around the world that the fighting for resources almost seems like it's played up for geopolitical control. But I'm not one to comment on me being a mastermind and knowing everything about the entire world, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. I have been Tyler Pick. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Theaters of War, and we will see you next week.